close your eyes and breathe. Let the weight of the modern world slip away from your shoulders, like sand through your fingers.
Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey, back through time, back before the age of towering pyramids and golden pharaohs, back to a quieter, simpler Egypt, where life moved to the rhythm of the river.
Can you hear it? The gentle lapping of water against the bank, the soft rustle of papyrus reeds in the evening breeze, the distant sound of voices speaking a language lost to time. We're going to walk together through a day in the life of people who lived 6,000 years ago. We'll wake with them at dawn, work beside them in the fields, sit by their fires as darkness falls. And as we journey together through their world, let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax, let yourself drift on the current of this story.
This is the world before history was written down, before kings ruled from palaces, before the great pyramids cast their shadows across the sand. This is the story of ordinary people living extraordinary lives along the greatest river on earth. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin.
Welcome, dear listener, to a journey back through time, back before the age of pharaohs and towering pyramids, back to a quieter, simpler Egypt, where life moved to the rhythm of the river. Close your eyes if you wish, and let us drift together down the Nile, to a time when people lived in small villages, grew their crops by hand, and watched the stars wheel overhead in the clear desert sky.
Tonight, we're going to explore what daily life was really like for the people who lived along the Nile River before Egypt became the mighty kingdom we read about in history books. We'll walk through their villages at dawn, watch them work in the fields, and sit by their fires at night. This is the story of the Badarian and Naqada cultures, people who lived between roughly 5000 and 3100 BCE in what we call the pre-dynastic period.
Take a deep breath. Settle in. Let the modern world fade away as we step into ancient Egypt, where the air smells of river water and baking bread, where children play in the dust, and where the most important sound is the gentle lapping of the Nile against its banks.
Imagine waking up just before sunrise in a small village along the Nile River, perhaps around 4500 BCE. The first thing you would notice is the coolness of the morning air, a blessed relief from the heat that will arrive later in the day. The sky is just beginning to lighten from deep indigo to soft purple and pink. You're lying on a woven reed mat inside a small dwelling made of mud brick or reeds. Your home is modest but functional. The walls are thick enough to keep out the worst of the day's heat. There might be a small window or two, covered with reed matting, that can be rolled up to let in the breeze. The floor is packed earth, swept clean each evening. In one corner sits a clay pot for water. In another, a basket holds the family's few possessions, some spare linen clothing, perhaps a comb made of wood or bone, a stone pallet for grinding cosmetics, and the tools needed for the day's work. Outside, you can hear the village beginning to stir. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. The soft lowing of cattle drifts from the pens at the edge of the settlement. Someone is already at work, the rhythmic sound of grinding grain echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. It's probably one of the women of the village, kneeling before a saddle quern, a large flat stone with a smaller stone that she pushes back and forth to grind barley or wheat into flour for the day's bread. You rise slowly from your mat, stretching muscles still warm from sleep. If you're a farmer, today will be much like yesterday and the day before, filled with work in the fields, tending to the animals, fishing, and maintaining the irrigation channels that bring life-giving water from the Nile to your crops. If you're a craftsperson, you might spend your day making pottery, weaving linen, or crafting tools from stone and copper. Let's walk outside together and see what this village looks like in the growing light. The village is small, perhaps home to a few dozen families, maybe 100 people in all. The houses cluster together near the riverbank, each one similar to your own, simple rectangular structures of mud brick or woven reeds, with flat roofs where people sometimes sleep on hot nights. Some of the more prosperous families might have houses with 2 or 3 rooms, but most dwellings consist of a single room where the whole family eats, sleeps, and takes shelter from the sun. The paths between the houses are narrow and winding, worn smooth by countless feet. Here and there you see small courtyards where families keep their cooking fires, grind their grain, and weave their cloth. Children's toys lie scattered about, simple dolls made of clay or rags, balls of leather or bundled reeds, carved wooden animals. As the sun breaks over the horizon, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and orange, the village comes fully to life. Men emerge from their homes, checking the weather with experienced eyes, planning the day's work. Women gather at the well or walk down to the river to fetch water in ceramic jugs, balanced carefully on their heads or hips. Children tumble out of doorways, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, ready to begin their own day of learning and play. The Nile itself is the heart of everything. Its presence dominates the landscape, a wide ribbon of life-giving water flowing northward through the desert. The riverbanks are green with vegetation, papyrus reeds growing in thick stands, date palms offering shade, and acacia trees dotting the landscape. Beyond the narrow strip of green, the desert begins abruptly, a realm of sand and stone that stretches to the horizon. This is the rhythm of life in pre-dynastic Egypt. Rise with the sun, work through the cooler morning hours, rest during the heat of midday, work again in the late afternoon, and gather in the evening as darkness falls. It's a life closely tied to the seasons, to the flooding of the Nile, and to the endless cycle of planting and harvest. Let's spend a day with these people and see exactly what they did from sunrise to sunset. The first order of business, after waking and perhaps washing face and hands in water drawn from the Nile, is breakfast. Bread is the foundation of every meal. The bread made in this era is a flat bread, coarse and dense, made from barley or wheat flour, mixed with water and perhaps a bit of salt. Some families might add a little fat or oil to make the bread more tender. The dough is shaped into round, flat loaves and baked on hot stones or in simple clay ovens. The woman who is grinding grain before dawn has now mixed her flour with water and is shaping the dough with practiced hands. She might make enough bread for several days, as the process is time-consuming. The bread will keep reasonably well in the dry climate, especially if stored in a covered basket or ceramic pot. Along with bread, the morning meal might include some fresh vegetables from the family garden. Green onions are particularly common and popular. The Egyptians grow their onions in small plots near their homes, where they can be tended and watered easily. The sharp, pungent flavor of the onions complements the bland taste of the bread. And of course, there is beer. Before you recoil at the idea of beer for breakfast, understand that ancient Egyptian beer is quite different from what we drink today. It's thick, nutritious, and relatively low in alcohol, more like liquid bread than modern beer. In fact, beer is made from partially baked bread that's crumbled into water and left to ferment. Beer serves as a major source of calories and nutrients, especially for people doing heavy physical labor. Even children drink it, though likely a weaker version than what the adults consume. A typical worker might receive a ration of 1 to 2 liters of beer per day as part of their compensation for labor. The process of making beer is usually a task that falls to the women of the household. They bake special beer bread, lightly baked so the yeast isn't killed. This bread is then crumbled over a sieve, washed with water in a large ceramic vat, and left to ferment for several days. The resulting beverage is cloudy and thick, often consumed through a straw to avoid the sediment at the bottom. As the family gathers for their morning meal, sitting on mats on the floor or on low stools, they eat with their fingers, tearing pieces of bread to scoop up onions or other vegetables. There's little ceremony to the meal. It's fuel for the work ahead. Conversation is quiet, perhaps about the tasks of the day, which field needs watering, whether the cattle should be taken to graze in the northern pasture, if the fishing nets need mending. In wealthier households, the morning meal might also include some fruit, dates or figs if they're in season, and perhaps a bit of cheese made from goats or cow's milk. But for most people, bread, onions, and beer are the standard fare. After the meal, the family disperses to their various tasks. The rhythm of the day is beginning in earnest now, with the sun climbing higher and the air starting to warm. Before we follow our ancient Egyptians into their daily tasks, it's important to understand that what they do each day depends greatly on the season. Life in pre-dynastic Egypt is intimately connected to the annual flooding cycle of the Nile, which dictates the rhythm of the agricultural year. The Egyptians recognize 3 main seasons, each about 4 months long. First is Akat, the inundation season, which lasts roughly from June through September. This is when the Nile floods its banks, swollen with rainwater from the highlands of Ethiopia far to the south. The floodwaters spread across the fields, depositing a layer of rich, dark silt, the black earth that makes Egypt so fertile. During this season, farming is impossible. The fields are underwater, and farmers turn to other tasks, repairing tools, weaving, making pottery, or working on communal projects. Next comes Paret, the growing season, from October through February. As the floodwaters recede, they leave behind the precious layer of silt. This is when the real work begins. Farmers must plow and plant their fields quickly while the soil is still moist enough to work. They plant barley and wheat, the staple grain crops, as well as flax for making linen, and various vegetables like lentils, chickpeas, and cucumbers. Once the seeds are in the ground, the crops need careful tending, watering through irrigation channels, weeding, and protecting the young plants from birds and other pests. Finally, there is Shamu, the harvest season, from March through May. This is the most intense period of agricultural labor. The crops have grown tall and golden, and they must be harvested before the Nile floods again. Teams of workers move through the fields with sickles, cutting the grain stalks close to the ground. The grain is then threshed to separate the seeds from the chaff and winnowed in the breeze. The precious grain is measured, recorded, and stored in large ceramic jars or in granaries made of mud brick. Throughout all 3 seasons, other work continues, tending animals, fishing, hunting, crafting tools and pottery, weaving cloth, and maintaining the complex system of irrigation channels that allows crops to grow even when the Nile isn't flooding. Let us imagine that today is a day in late autumn, during the early part of Paret, the growing season. The fields have recently been planted, and now they require constant attention. As the morning sun climbs higher, men and boys make their way out to the fields. These fields lie in the narrow strip of fertile land between the river and the desert, the so-called black land that contrasts so sharply with the red land of the surrounding desert. The fields are not large by modern standards. Each family might farm only a few acres, perhaps less. The land is divided into smaller plots by low embankments of earth that also serve as pathways and as boundaries for irrigation. Irrigation is crucial in Egypt, where rainfall is minimal. The Egyptians have developed a system of canals and channels to direct water from the Nile to their fields. During the pre-dynastic period, this system is still relatively simple, nothing like the elaborate networks that will be built in later centuries. But even in this early era, farmers dig trenches from the riverbank to their fields and use simple tools to lift water from the river to the higher ground.
One such tool is the shadoof, a counterweighted lever with a bucket on one end. A farmer stands by the river, dipping the bucket into the water, then swinging it up and over to pour into an irrigation channel. It's repetitive, tiring work, but absolutely necessary. The crops will wither and die without regular watering. Today, one of the men checks the irrigation channels, walking slowly along the embankments, looking for places where the earth has eroded or where weeds are blocking the flow of water. He carries a simple wooden hoe, which he uses to scrape away debris and rebuild the earthen walls. This is constant, ongoing work throughout the growing season. In the fields themselves, other workers are tending to the young crops. The barley and wheat seedlings have sprouted, creating a green haze across the dark soil. But so have weeds, and these must be pulled before they choke out the grain. Several people move slowly through the field, bent at the waist, their hands busy pulling up unwanted plants and tossing them aside. It's backbreaking labor, made bearable only by the knowledge that the crops depend on it. Birds are another constant threat. Flocks of wild birds descend on the fields, eager to feast on the tender shoots. Children are often given the task of bird scaring, standing at the edges of the fields, shouting and waving their arms, throwing stones, or using simple slings to drive the birds away. It's tedious work for the children, but it's also important training for later life. Boys learn about the crops and the land, developing the knowledge they'll need when they become farmers themselves. The work continues steadily through the morning. The farmers move with a rhythm born of long practice, their movements efficient and economical. There's little wasted motion. Every action has a purpose. Some farmers are working with the draft animals, cattle primarily, though also donkeys. These animals are used to pull simple plows, breaking up the soil to prepare it for planting or to aerate the earth around growing crops. The plow in this period is a basic wooden implement, essentially a sharpened stick that's dragged through the soil. It doesn't turn the soil over the way a modern plow does. It simply scratches a furrow into which seeds can be dropped. Guiding a plow behind a team of cattle is skilled work. The farmer must keep the furrow straight, maintain a steady pace, and manage the animals, who have their own ideas about where they want to go and how fast they want to walk. Young boys learn this skill by following their fathers, first watching, then holding the plow for short stretches under careful supervision. The cattle themselves are valuable property. A family that owns several head of cattle is considered prosperous. The animals provide not only labor, but also milk, hides for leather, and eventually meat, though cattle are rarely slaughtered except for important occasions or religious festivals. They're too valuable as work animals to be treated as a food source. Caring for the cattle is another daily task. They must be taken to pasture to graze, brought to water, and kept safe from predators at night. Boys often work as herders, learning to manage the animals, understanding their behavior, and protecting them from the dangers of the wild, lions, crocodiles, and other predators that roam the edges of the settled land. As midday approaches and the sun reaches its zenith, the heat becomes intense. The farmers begin to make their way back toward the village, ready for the midday rest period. By noon, the sun is directly overhead, and the heat is almost unbearable. This is the time for siesta, a period of rest during the hottest part of the day.
All across Egypt, work slows or stops entirely as people seek shade and respite from the burning sun. The farmers return to their homes or to shelters at the edge of the fields, simple structures of reed and palm fronds that provide shade. They sit or lie down, drinking water or beer, eating a small meal of bread, perhaps with some onions or dried fish. This is a quiet time. Conversation is desultory, lazy. Some people doze. Children play quietly in the shade, or they might go down to the river to splash in the shallows, cooling themselves in the water under the watchful eyes of their elders. The Nile River is the center of community life in many ways. It's not only the source of water for drinking, cooking, and irrigation, but also a place for bathing, washing clothes, and socializing. During the heat of the day, the river offers blessed coolness. However, the Nile is also dangerous. Crocodiles lurk in the deeper waters, and hippopotamuses, massive, aggressive animals, are a constant threat. People learn from childhood to be cautious near the water, to watch for signs of these predators, and to stay in the shallows where it's safer. Hunting hippopotamuses is considered a mark of high status and skill, as these animals are both dangerous and powerful. The crocodile, feared as it is, also holds a special place in the spiritual life of early Egyptians. Even in this pre-dynastic period, before the formal religion of later Egypt has fully developed, people recognize certain animals as sacred or as having special power. The crocodile is one such creature, respected for its strength and ferocity, and sometimes propitiated with offerings to ensure safety on the river. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to our village and the midday rest. In the cooler interiors of the homes, women continue their work, though at a slower pace. There's always something to do: grinding grain, preparing food, nursing babies, mending clothing, or spinning flax into thread. Unlike the heavy field labor that must be done during the cooler hours, these tasks can be carried out throughout the day. One woman sits in the doorway of her home, a wooden spindle in her hands, twisting fibers into thread. The spindle rotates, its weight pulling the thread tight and even. This thread will eventually be woven into linen cloth, the primary textile of ancient Egypt. The process is slow and requires skill, but the result is fabric that's both durable and comfortable in the Egyptian climate. Another woman is working with clay, shaping a pot with her hands. Pottery is essential for storing water, grain, beer, and other foodstuffs. The Badarian and Nakata cultures are known for their distinctive pottery styles. The Badarians make beautiful black-topped redware, while the Nakata people create vessels with painted decorations, showing boats, animals, and geometric patterns. Making pottery is an art that requires both skill and patience. The potter must prepare the clay by removing stones and other impurities, then knead it thoroughly to make it workable. She shapes the vessel by hand, slowly building up the walls from the base, smoothing and refining as she goes. Once shaped, the pot must be left to dry completely before firing. Firing pottery is a communal activity, as it requires a substantial fire. Several potters will bring their dried vessels to be fired together in a pit or a simple kiln. The pots are stacked carefully, covered with fuel, wood, brush, or dried dung, and the fire is lit. The firing process takes hours, during which the potters must carefully tend the fire, ensuring it burns hot enough to harden the clay without cracking the vessels. The distinctive black tops of Badarian pottery are created by inverting the pots in the ashes at the end of firing, which creates a smoky, oxygen-poor environment that turns the exposed clay black. As the midday rest period continues, let's take a moment to think about what life is like for the children in this village. Childhood in pre-dynastic Egypt is both similar to and different from childhood in our modern world. Children are deeply valued. They're seen as the heart of the family, the ones who will carry on the lineage and care for their parents in old age. Infants and very young children are indulged and protected. Mothers nurse their babies for several years, and the entire extended family helps care for young children. Female relatives, grandmothers, aunts, older sisters, all take part in childcare, allowing mothers to continue their work. Children have toys, dolls made of clay, wood, or rags, balls of leather stuffed with reeds or straw, carved wooden animals. Archaeological excavations have found these items in ancient settlements, evidence that even in this distant past, children played and imagined, just as they do today. But childhood doesn't last long in the modern sense. By the age of 5 or 6, children begin to take on real responsibilities. This is when their education truly begins. Not in schools, those don't exist yet for most people, but through practical apprenticeship with their parents. Girls stay close to their mothers, learning the skills they'll need as wives and mothers themselves. Grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, spinning and weeding, making pottery, tending gardens, and managing households. They might also learn about medicinal plants, how to prepare various foods, and how to care for younger children. Boys follow their fathers, learning whatever trade or occupation the father practices. For most boys, this means farming, learning to plow, to judge the right time for planting, to manage irrigation, to harvest grain, and to care for animals. But boys whose fathers are craftsmen, potters, weavers, tool makers, learn those skills instead. The education is entirely hands-on. A boy might start by carrying water to the workers in the field, then progress to scaring birds, then to pulling weeds, then to guiding the plow under supervision, and finally to handling all aspects of farming independently. Each step builds on the previous one, and by the time a boy reaches adolescence, he's already a skilled worker. Both boys and girls are encouraged to play games that develop strength and agility. Wrestling is popular among boys. Running races test speed and endurance. There are ball games and games of skill. These activities serve both as entertainment and as physical training for the demanding work of adult life. The transition to adulthood is marked by specific rituals. For boys, there is the ceremony of circumcision, which signals the end of childhood and the beginning of manhood. For girls, the onset of menstruation marks the transition to womanhood and marriageability. Throughout their childhood, children also learn the values and beliefs of their community. Parents teach them to be honest, to respect their elders, to work hard, and to care for family members. They learn about the spirits and gods that inhabit the world, about the proper ways to make offerings, and about the stories that explain the world around them. Even in these early times, religion and spirituality are woven into daily life. Animals are seen as having special significance, the cow for its nurturing milk, the bull for its strength, the hippopotamus for its power, the crocodile for its ferocity. Birds, especially hawks and ibises, are watched closely as they seem to bridge the earth and sky. The sun itself is revered, its daily journey across the heavens, a sign of the divine order. As the midday rest period ends and the worst heat of the day passes, people begin to stir again, ready to return to their afternoon tasks. The afternoon in pre-dynastic Egypt brings a return to work, though the pace remains slower than the mornings as the air is still warm. For the farmers, there are always tasks to attend to. Those with gardens near their homes might spend the afternoon watering vegetables, pulling weeds, or harvesting whatever is ripe. These gardens are small but important, providing onions, garlic, cucumbers, melons, and other vegetables that supplement the grain-based diet. The gardens require intensive care because they're located away from the natural flooding of the Nile. Water must be carried from the river or well, bucket by bucket, and poured carefully around each plant. It's tiring work, especially in the heat, but the fresh vegetables are worth the effort. Some men spend the afternoon fishing. The Nile is rich with fish of many varieties, and fishing provides an important source of protein. The fishing techniques are varied and sophisticated. Some fishermen use nets woven from flax fibers, stretching them across channels or casting them from the riverbank. Others use woven basket traps that allow fish to swim in but not out. Still others use hooks made of bone or copper, attached to lines of twisted flax. Fishing is often a social activity. Several men might work together, handling a large net or manning a small boat made of papyrus reeds. These boats are remarkable craft, bundles of papyrus bound tightly together to form a crescent-shaped vessel that floats surprisingly well. They're not suitable for long journeys or rough water, but for fishing close to shore or traveling short distances along the river, they work perfectly. The fishermen must be constantly alert for crocodiles and hippopotamuses. A crocodile can easily overturn a small papyrus boat, and a hippopotamus is even more dangerous, capable of smashing a boat to pieces in its anger. Experienced fishermen learn to read the water, to spot the signs of these animals, and to give them wide berth. The fish that are caught are brought back to the village, where they're cleaned and prepared. Some fish are eaten fresh, but many are preserved by drying or salting, allowing them to be stored for later consumption. The drying process is simple. Fish are split open, gutted, and laid out in the sun on reed mats. In Egypt's dry climate, they dehydrate quickly, becoming hard and leathery but edible for months. Meanwhile, other members of the community are engaged in different tasks. Some men hunt in the desert fringes or in the thickets along the river. Game animals include gazelles, hares, wild birds, ducks, geese, and other waterfowl that nest in the papyrus marshes. Hunting is done with bows and arrows, with spears, or with throwing sticks similar to boomerangs. The bows are simple but effective, made of wood and strung with sinew or plant fibers. Arrows are fitted with carefully crafted flint arrowheads attached to wooden shafts and fletched with feathers for stability. The making of these arrowheads is a skilled craft in itself, requiring precise flaking of flint to create sharp, symmetrical points. Hunters who successfully bring down a gazelle or other large game are celebrated, as the meat is a welcome addition to the diet. The entire animal is used. The meat is butchered and distributed among families. The hide is processed into leather for sandals, bags, and other items. The bones are made into tools, and even the sinews are saved for use as cordage. Women also continue their work throughout the afternoon. Weaving is a major activity. Linen cloth is produced entirely at home, from the growing of the flax to the finished fabric. Flax is harvested during shemu, when the plants are pulled up by the roots and laid out to dry. The dried flax is then processed through several steps to separate the useful fibers from the woody parts of the plant. This process, called retting, involves soaking the flax in water, then beating it, and finally combing it to produce long, smooth fibers. These fibers are spun into thread using a hand spindle, as we saw earlier. The spinning produces fine, strong thread that can then be woven into cloth. The weaving itself is done on simple looms, horizontal looms where the warp threads are stretched between two beams and the weaver sits or kneels to pass the weft thread back and forth. The resulting linen is prized for its coolness and comfort in the hot climate. Linen clothing is worn by everyone, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest village leader. The quality and fineness of the linen vary according to skill and time invested. Coarse linen for everyday work clothes, finer linen for special occasions. Clothing in this period is simple. Men typically wear a short kilt or loincloth, though during work in the fields they might wear nothing at all. Women wear simple sheath dresses made from a rectangle of linen, though working women might wear less or a kilt similar to the men's. Children often go naked, especially when young.
Other craftspeople are at work as well. A man sits in the shade of a tree working on stone tools. He's a skilled knapper, someone who shapes stone by striking it with another stone or with a piece of bone or antler. With each precise blow, flakes split off, gradually shaping the stone into the desired form. An axe head, a knife blade, a scraper, a sickle. The tools he's making are essential for daily life. Sickles, fitted into wooden handles, are used to harvest grain. Axes are needed for cutting wood and for construction. Scrapers are used to process animal hides. Knives serve countless purposes. Some of his tools are made from flint, a hard stone that fractures predictably and can be worked to razor sharpness. Other tools are made from copper, which is beginning to be used more commonly in this period. Copper can be hammered into shape and sharpened, though it's softer than stone and requires more frequent resharpening. Copper tools are something of a status symbol. They're more expensive than stone tools and indicate a certain level of wealth. As the afternoon wears on, the angle of the sun changes, casting longer shadows. The air begins to cool slightly, bringing relief from the day's heat. People's thoughts turn toward the evening meal and the coming night. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the pace of work gradually slows. People make their way back to the village from the fields, from the river, from wherever their afternoon tasks have taken them. This is a pleasant time of day, when the heat has broken but there's still enough light to see. The air smells of cooking fires and baking bread. Children's voices rise in laughter and play. Cattle low as they're herded back into their pens for the night. Dogs bark greetings to returning family members. The evening meal is the main meal of the day, when the whole family gathers together. Like breakfast, the meal is built around bread and beer, but there might be more variety in the accompaniments. If it's been a good day for fishing, there will be fresh or dried fish. Vegetables from the garden, onions, garlic, cucumbers are served. During harvest time, there might be fresh fruits, dates, figs, or melons. On special occasions, or in wealthier households, there might even be meat, goat, lamb, or beef roasted over the fire. The aroma of roasting meat is intoxicating, and such occasions are cause for celebration. More commonly, though, meat comes in the form of preserved or salted meat, or in small quantities used to flavor a stew of vegetables and lentils. The family sits together to eat, often outside in the cooling air, sitting on mats or low stools. The meal is eaten with fingers, using pieces of bread to scoop up food. There's conversation, talk of the day's events, plans for tomorrow, news from other families in the village. After the meal, as darkness falls, is a time for socializing and for storytelling. People gather in small groups outside their homes or in common areas of the village. A fire might be lit, not for warmth, the nights are mild except in winter, but for light and for the comfort of its presence. This is when the oral traditions are passed down. Elders tell stories about the ancestors, about great hunts, about the floods of years past, about the spirits that inhabit the land and water. These stories serve multiple purposes. They entertain, they educate, they preserve history, and they teach moral lessons. Children listen raptly to these tales, absorbing the wisdom and knowledge of their elders. They learn about which plants are safe to eat and which are poisonous, about how to read the signs of the coming flood, about the proper way to treat animals and other people, about the sacred places in the landscape.
Music and singing are also part of evening entertainment. People clap their hands rhythmically, creating simple but compelling beats. Some families might have simple instruments, drums made from stretched animal hide over a clay or wooden frame, flutes carved from bone or reed, rattles made from gourds filled with seeds. The music is not just for entertainment, it's also intimately connected with religious and spiritual practices. Songs might be sung to honor the spirits, to ask for good harvests, to celebrate successful hunts, or to mark important life events, births, marriages, deaths. Dancing, too, plays a role in community life. People dance to celebrate harvests, to mark festivals, to express joy. The dancing is communal, with many people moving together in coordinated patterns, their feet stirring up the dust, their bodies swaying to the rhythm of drums and clapping. For farmers, dancing is particularly associated with giving thanks for successful harvests. After the grain has been brought in, threshed, and stored, there's a sense of relief and joy that finds expression in dancing and singing. It's a release of the tension built up during the hard work of harvest, and a way of acknowledging the gifts of the land and the river. Even in this early period, there are people who specialize in music and dance, performers who can be hired for special occasions. These might be traveling performers who move from village to village, or they might be attached to wealthier households or to early forms of religious institutions. As the evening deepens into night, the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, brilliant and numerous without the light pollution that obscures them in our modern world. The Milky Way stretches across the heavens, a river of light, mirroring the Nile below. The ancient Egyptians watched these stars with both practical and spiritual interest, noting their movements, learning to use them for navigation and for marking the seasons. Gradually, people retire to their homes. Mothers settle children on their sleeping mats. Men and women lie down, tired from the day's labor. The village grows quiet, though never completely silent. Always there are the sounds of animals, the whisper of the breeze through the palm fronds, the distant call of night birds, the ever-present murmur of the river. Tomorrow will bring another day of work, of tending crops and animals, of crafting the necessities of life. But for now, there is rest. Let's take some time now to look more deeply at some of the crafts and arts that occupied the people of pre-dynastic Egypt. These activities were not separate from daily life. They were essential parts of it, providing the tools, containers, clothing, and decorative objects that made life both possible and meaningful. We've already touched on pottery, but it deserves more attention as it's one of the most distinctive and beautiful products of this period. The pottery of the Bedouin culture, dating from roughly 4400 to 4000 BCE, is especially notable. Bedouin potters created vessels with thin walls, sometimes thinner than any other pre-dynastic pottery, that required great skill to produce without cracking. The most characteristic Bedouin pottery is the black-topped redware, vessels that are red over most of their surface, but black at the rim and on the interior. This distinctive coloring is achieved through a specific firing technique. The potter first fires the vessel in an oxygen-rich environment, which turns the clay red. Then, near the end of the firing process, the pot is inverted into the ashes or covered in a way that restricts oxygen. This creates a reducing atmosphere that turns the exposed portions black. The result is striking, a warm red body transitioning to deep black at the top. The surfaces of Bedouin pottery often have a rippled or combed texture, created by drawing a tool across the surface of the clay while it's still moist. This creates a pattern that catches the light beautifully and also provides texture for grip. Many vessels are also highly polished,
burnished with a smooth stone while the clay is leather-hard, creating a subtle sheen. The forms of Badarian pottery are varied: bowls for eating and serving, jars for storage, bottles for liquids, and specialized shapes for specific purposes. Some vessels are quite large, capable of holding many liters of grain or water, further evidence that the Badarians were settled people, not nomads, as such large, fragile vessels would be impractical for a wandering life.
The Nakata culture, which follows and overlaps with the Badarian, has its own distinctive pottery styles. Nakata pottery often features painted decoration in addition to or instead of the black-topped ware. These decorations include geometric patterns, waves, spirals, zigzags, as well as more representational images: boats, animals, human figures, and plants.
One particularly interesting motif is boats with many oars painted on the sides of large jars. These boats sometimes carry standards or banners, suggesting ceremonial or religious significance. The paintings give us glimpses into the worldview of the Nakata people, showing us what was important to them, what they saw in their daily lives, and how they conceptualized their world.
Some Nakata pottery shows possible influence from other cultures. Designs like griffins and serpent-headed panthers might have been inspired by art from Mesopotamia, suggesting trade contacts and cultural exchange over long distances. Pottery from the Levant has been found at Egyptian sites, confirming that these people were not isolated, but were part of a broader network of interaction.
Beyond pottery, stoneworking was another important craft.
We've mentioned the flaking of flint and other stones to create cutting tools, but stoneworkers also created other objects: pallets for grinding cosmetics, beads and amulets for jewelry, and decorative vessels carved from harder stones like alabaster or porphyry. The cosmetic pallets are particularly interesting. These are flat stones, often shaped into ovals, rectangles, or more fanciful forms like fish or boats. The pallets have a smooth, slightly concave surface on which mineral pigments can be ground with a smaller stone pestle. The resulting powder is mixed with water or oil to create cosmetics.
Both men and women in ancient Egypt used cosmetics, particularly eye makeup. The most common pigment was green malachite, a copper-based mineral that could be ground to a fine powder and applied around the eyes. The Egyptians believed this makeup had both beautifying and protective properties. The dark pigment around the eyes helped reduce glare from the bright sun and might also have had some antimicrobial properties that helped prevent eye infections.
Jewelry was another important art form. Even in this early period, people adorned themselves with beads, amulets, and other ornaments. These were made from a variety of materials: shell, bone, ivory, stone, and eventually glazed ceramic and copper. Beads were made by drilling holes through small pieces of material, a process that required patience and specialized tools. The holes were created using bow drills, a stone or copper drill bit rotated rapidly by pulling back and forth on a bow, gradually boring through the bead material. Strings of beads were worn as necklaces, bracelets, and anklets. The materials used for jewelry often came from distant sources, indicating trade networks that extended far beyond the Nile Valley. Glazed steatite beads found at Badarian sites were not made locally. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used for making sharp blades, was imported from Ethiopia. Porphyry, a decorative stone used for pallets and other objects, came from the Red Sea Mountains. Cedar wood found in tombs shows trade with Lebanon. This trade was crucial to the economy and culture of pre-dynastic Egypt. The Nakata people, in particular, seem to have been active traders, exchanging their pottery, cloth, and other goods with peoples to the south, Nubia, to the northeast, the Levant, and even with more distant regions. This trade brought not only raw materials, but also ideas, artistic influences, and technological innovations. Metalworking was beginning to develop during this period, though it was still relatively limited compared to later eras. Copper was the primary metal worked, usually hammered into shape rather than cast. Copper tools and weapons appear in archaeological context from this period: harpoon points for hunting hippopotamus, knife blades, pins, and small decorative items. The copper itself had to be imported, probably from the Sinai Peninsula or from mines in the eastern desert, adding to its value. A person who owned copper tools or weapons was displaying their wealth and status. Most people continued to use stone tools for everyday tasks, turning to copper only for special purposes or when they could afford it. Woodworking was another essential craft, though wood was scarce in Egypt and had to be used carefully. The native trees, palms, acacias, provided wood suitable for some purposes, but they don't grow straight, tall trunks good for construction or for making long, straight tool handles. Better wood had to be imported, which again was expensive. Woodworkers made tool handles, furniture, simple stools and bed frames, boats, and the beams needed for house construction. They worked with copper or stone tools to cut, shape, and join the wood. Some items were carved with decorative elements, showing the artistic sensibilities of the craftspeople. The most sophisticated wooden objects were the decorated knife handles found in some Naqada period contexts. These handles, carved from ivory or fine-grained wood, featured detailed scenes, people in procession, animals, religious symbols. The carving is remarkably skilled, with fine details and a sense of composition. These objects were clearly prestige items, owned by wealthy or important individuals. All of these crafts, pottery, stoneworking, jewelry making, metalworking, woodworking, required years of training to master. Knowledge and skill were passed from generation to generation, often within families. A potter's children would grow up watching and helping their parent, gradually learning the secrets of clay preparation, vessel formation, and firing. A skilled napper would teach his techniques to his sons or apprentices, showing them exactly how to strike the stone, at what angle, with how much force, to produce the desired flake. This transmission of knowledge was oral and practical, not written. There was no formal schooling, no textbooks or instruction manuals. Everything was learned by watching, listening, practicing, and receiving feedback from more experienced practitioners. The crafts were not separate from daily life or reserved for specialists, at least not completely. Many people could do basic pottery making, basic tool making, basic weaving. But there were also individuals who developed exceptional skill and who devoted much of their time to their craft, producing objects of higher quality or complexity. These craftspeople might trade their products for food and other necessities, creating an early form of occupational specialization.
Now, let's turn our attention to how these small pre-dynastic communities were organized socially. What was the structure of society? Who had power and authority? How did people relate to one another?
The communities were small, as we've mentioned, perhaps a few dozen to a few hundred people living in a single village. In such small groups, everyone knew everyone else. Relationships were personal and face-to-face. Your neighbors were not just the people living near you. They were your extended family, your coworkers, the people you'd known your entire life. Society was organized primarily around kinship. Extended families lived near one another and worked together. A typical household might include not just parents and children, but also grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. This extended family was the basic social and economic unit. Within the family, gender roles were defined, but not rigidly so. Men typically did the heavy agricultural labor, plowing, irrigation work, harvesting, and hunting. Women managed households, prepared food, made clothing, and tended gardens. But there was overlap and flexibility. Women also worked in the fields during busy seasons like planting and harvest. Men might help with food preparation or other household tasks. Importantly, women in early Egypt had significant social roles and status. They weren't confined to the household or treated as property. Women could manage households independently, could participate in religious ceremonies, and could engage in craft production and trade. There's evidence of female participation in various aspects of community life, suggesting a relatively egalitarian society compared to some other ancient cultures. Children, as we've discussed, were highly valued. Large families were desirable, both for the labor they provided and for the security they represented in old age. If a couple couldn't have children, adoption was practiced. The community as a whole took responsibility for teaching and socializing children, not just their immediate parents. Beyond the family level, there was emerging social stratification, differences in wealth and status. Archaeological evidence, particularly from burial practices, shows this clearly. At Badarian and Nakata burial sites, some graves contain more and better grave goods than others, more pottery, jewelry, tools, and other objects. This suggests that some members of the community were more prosperous and of higher status than others. What created these differences? Several factors likely played a role. Some individuals might have been more skilled farmers, producing more food than needed for their own families, and thus having a surplus to trade. Others might have had exceptional craft skills, creating objects that were in high demand. Still others might have inherited property or goods from previous generations, accumulating wealth over time. Leadership in these early communities was probably informal and based on respect and consensus rather than formal political authority. Elders who had demonstrated wisdom and good judgment would be consulted on important decisions. Skilled hunters or farmers would be looked to for advice in their areas of expertise. People with religious knowledge or who seemed to have special connections to the spiritual world would lead ceremonies and rituals. There's no evidence yet of the kind of centralized political authority that would later characterize pharaonic Egypt. No palaces, no royal tombs, no inscriptions proclaiming the power of kings. This is still a world of villages and small-scale societies, where governance happens through consensus and tradition rather than through coercion and formal law. However, the seeds of later social complexity are visible. As some individuals and families accumulated more wealth, they gained influence. As villages grew larger and more settlements appeared along the Nile, interactions between communities became more frequent and more complex. The need for coordination, for managing irrigation systems that served multiple communities, for organizing defense against raiders or wild animals, for conducting large-scale trading expeditions, would eventually lead to more formal leadership structures. Trade between communities was already established. We know this from the presence of non-local materials in archaeological sites, stone from particular quarries, pottery in styles from other regions, objects that clearly were made elsewhere and brought in through exchange. This trade created relationships between communities, networks of reciprocal obligation and mutual benefit. Markets, in the formal sense, probably didn't exist yet. Instead, trade was likely conducted through personal relationships and gift exchange. A community that produced excellent pottery might trade vessels for grain from a community with better farmland. A village near good fishing grounds might exchange dried fish for flax from a village with better land for growing that crop. Such exchanges would be negotiated between families or community leaders, with the terms based on mutual need and custom rather than on any formal price system. Religious life was also a unifying force in the community, though religion in this period was quite different from the complex, formal system that would develop in later Egypt. There were no great temples yet, no organized priesthood in the way we think of it. Instead, religion was personal and communal, woven into every aspect of daily life. People recognized various spirits and powers in the world around them. The Nile itself was sacred, the source of all life. The sun, whose daily journey brought light and warmth, was revered. Animals, especially those that were powerful or dangerous or mysterious, were seen as manifestations of sacred power. The crocodile, the hippopotamus, the lion, the bull, the falcon.
Religious practices included offerings and sacrifices to these powers, seeking their favor and protection. A farmer might leave a small offering by an irrigation channel, asking the spirit of the water to flow freely. A hunter might make an offering before the hunt, asking for success. A woman about to give birth might invoke the protection of the hippopotamus goddess, who represented both the danger and the power of childbirth. There were also rituals marking important life transitions: birth, the transition to adulthood, marriage, death. These rituals served both spiritual and social functions, acknowledging the importance of these moments and integrating individuals into their proper roles within the community.
Burial practices give us particular insight into religious beliefs. The dead were buried with care, placed in graves dug into the desert sand beyond the cultivation area. The body was positioned on its side, often in a contracted or fetal position. Grave goods were placed with the deceased: pottery vessels containing food and drink, personal items like jewelry and cosmetic palettes, tools appropriate to the person's status and occupation.
These burial practices reveal a belief in some form of afterlife, where the dead person would need the things they had used in life. The fact that more prestigious people were buried with more and better goods suggests emerging concepts of social hierarchy that extended beyond death. Communal celebrations and festivals punctuated the year, providing occasions for the community to come together. These festivals often coincided with important points in the agricultural calendar: the beginning of the flood season, the time of planting, the harvest. They provided breaks from the routine of work, opportunities for feasting, music, dancing, and socializing.
Even though these were small communities with simple technology, life was not unremittingly harsh or grim. There was time for pleasure, for art, for beauty, for celebration. People laughed and danced and sang. They took pride in their crafts, creating objects that were not merely functional, but also aesthetically pleasing. They told stories and played games. They formed deep bonds with family and friends.
The people of pre-dynastic Egypt lived in intimate connection with the natural world. Their survival depended on understanding the patterns of nature: the flooding of the Nile, the movements of animals, the growth of plants, the progression of the seasons. The Nile River was, of course, the central fact of existence. Everything depended on it. The river provided water for drinking, cooking, and irrigation. It provided fish and waterfowl for food. It provided papyrus reeds for making boats, mats, and baskets. Its annual flood renewed the soil, making agriculture possible in what would otherwise be desert. Understanding the flood was crucial. The water began to rise in June, swelled through July and August, and reached its peak in September, before gradually receding through October and November. The height of the flood varied from year to year. Some years it was high, depositing abundant silt and promising good harvests. Other years it was lower, meaning less fertile soil and the prospect of scarcity. The ancient Egyptians didn't understand the distant causes of the flood, that it was caused by monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands, thousands of miles to the south. To them, the flood was a mystery, a gift from the divine powers that governed the world. They watched for its beginning with both hope and anxiety, and they celebrated when it arrived on time and in good measure. The floodwaters brought not only water and silt, but also challenges. When the fields were underwater, the usual agricultural work was impossible. This was a time for maintenance and repair, fixing tools, rebuilding irrigation channels and embankments that had been damaged by the previous flood, making new pottery and baskets, weaving cloth and working on community projects. It was also a time when able-bodied men might be called upon for larger public works, the precursors to the massive building projects of later pharaonic Egypt. Early versions of temples or community buildings might be constructed during the flood season when labor was available. This practice of using flood season labor would eventually lead to the pyramids and other monuments, but in this pre-dynastic period, the scale was much smaller. The desert that bounded the narrow strip of fertile land along the Nile was both barrier and resource. The desert protected Egypt from invasion, creating a natural boundary that was difficult to cross. But the desert also contained resources: stone for tools and building, minerals like malachite for cosmetics, and copper ore for metalworking, and game animals that could be hunted. The desert was also a place of mystery and danger, the realm of wild things, the place where the dead were buried. The contrast between the black land of a fertile Nile valley and the red land of the desert was stark and fundamental to Egyptian thinking. Life flourished in the black land. The red land was the domain of chaos and death. The wildlife of Egypt was diverse and abundant. In the river and along its banks lived crocodiles, hippopotamuses, fish of many kinds, frogs, turtles, and water birds, ducks, geese, herons, ibises. The papyrus marshes were havens for wildlife, providing shelter and breeding grounds. On land, there were more animals than we see in Egypt today, as the climate was slightly wetter and the landscape supported more vegetation. Gazelles grazed in the desert fringes. Lions prowled the edges of the settled areas, dangerous predators that occasionally took livestock or even attacked humans. Wild cattle, ancestors of domestic breeds, roamed in small herds. Jackals, foxes, and wild dogs scavenged and hunted smaller prey. In the skies, raptors ruled, falcons, hawks, and vultures riding the thermal currents, their keen eyes scanning for prey. These birds fascinated the Egyptians, who saw in them power, freedom, and a connection to the heavens. The falcon especially would become one of the most important religious symbols in later Egyptian culture, associated with the god Horus. But even in this early period, raptors were viewed with awe. The Egyptians had a deep knowledge of animal behavior, born of careful observation. They knew where and when to find certain fish, what the movements of birds signified, how to track game in the desert, and how to avoid dangerous animals. This knowledge was practical, it was necessary for survival, but it also reflected a deep engagement with the natural world, a sense of being part of nature rather than separate from it. Plants, too, were intimately known. The Egyptians knew which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, and which were poisonous. They gathered wild plants to supplement their cultivated crops: nuts, fruits, berries, roots, and leaves. They knew when each plant would be ready for harvest and where to find it. The date palm was especially valuable, providing sweet, nutritious fruit that could be eaten fresh or dried for storage. Palm fronds were used for thatching roofs and for weaving mats and baskets. The sturdy trunks could be used as building material. A grove of date palms was a treasure, carefully tended and protected. Acacia trees provided wood and also produced edible gum, which oozed from the bark and could be collected and eaten or used as an adhesive. The acacia's thorny branches made natural fencing for corrals and gardens, keeping out animals that might damage crops. Papyrus, which grew abundantly in the marshes along the Nile, was used for countless purposes. The stems could be bundled to make boats, mats, sandals, and baskets. The inner pith could be processed into a writing surface, though actual writing was still in the future. The roots were edible, either cooked or raw. Even the fluffy seed heads had uses, as stuffing or tinder. Flax, which we've mentioned before as the source of linen, grew well in Egyptian soil. It required careful cultivation,
The plants needed to be pulled up by the roots at just the right time, not too early or too late, to get fibers of the right length and quality. But the effort was worthwhile, as linen was the primary textile, essential for clothing and other purposes.
The Egyptians also understood the relationships between different species and the balance of nature. They knew that certain birds fed on insects that could damage crops, so those birds were encouraged. They understood that predators like cats controlled rodent populations, protecting stored grain. This understanding would eventually lead to the domestication of the cat.
The night sky was another aspect of the natural world that the Egyptians observed closely. Without artificial light, the stars were brilliantly clear. The Egyptians learned to recognize patterns, constellations, and to track the movements of the planets. They understood that the stars rotated through the sky over the course of the night, and that different stars were visible in different seasons. One star was particularly important, Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. The Egyptians noticed that Sirius disappeared below the horizon for a period each year, then reappeared just before dawn, at roughly the time when the Nile began to flood. This heliacal rising of Sirius became a marker for the beginning of the year, a sign that the inundation was coming. The connection between the star and the flood seemed significant, perhaps even causal in ancient thinking.
The phases of the moon provided another natural calendar. The monthly cycle from new moon to full moon and back again was easy to observe and could be used to mark the passage of time, to schedule activities, and to plan festivals.
Living in such close connection with nature, the ancient Egyptians developed what we might call an ecological consciousness. They understood that they were dependent on the health of the land, the river, and the wildlife. They knew that overuse could lead to depletion, that certain practices were sustainable while others were not. This didn't make them perfect environmentalists by modern standards. They hunted animals, some of which would eventually be driven to local extinction. They cut trees, contributing to deforestation. They altered the landscape with their canals and fields, but they did so within limits, constrained by their small population and simple technology, and with an awareness that the natural world was not infinitely resilient.
Let's turn now to consider health and healing in pre-dynastic Egypt. How did people deal with illness and injury? What did they understand about the human body? What practices did they use to maintain health? Life expectancy in this period was considerably shorter than in modern developed countries. Infant mortality was high. Many children died before reaching their 5th birthday from diseases, accidents, or malnutrition. Those who survived childhood had a reasonable chance of living into their 40s or 50s, though reaching old age beyond 60 was rare. The hazards of daily life were numerous. Farming and other physical labor led to injuries, cuts, sprains, broken bones. Working in the fields under the hot sun could lead to heat exhaustion or dehydration. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and baby, with no modern medical intervention available if complications arose. Diseases were common. Without modern sanitation, waterborne illnesses spread easily. Parasitic infections were endemic. People who drank Nile water or ate fish from the river often harbored intestinal parasites. Schistosomiasis, caused by a parasitic worm that lives in fresh water, was likely common and caused chronic illness. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes that bred in the standing water along the river, was another serious health problem. Dental health was poor by modern standards. The bread that formed the staple of the diet was coarse and often contained grit, sand, and stone particles from the grinding process. This grit wore down teeth, causing severe dental attrition. By middle age, many people had teeth worn nearly to the gum line, which must have been painful and made eating difficult. Dental abscesses and infections were common. Despite these challenges, the ancient Egyptians developed a substantial body of medical knowledge and healing practices. Much of this knowledge would be written down in later periods in texts like the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, But the practices themselves were developed through centuries of experience and experimentation in the pre-dynastic period.
Healing in ancient Egypt combined practical medical techniques, herbal remedies, and spiritual practices. The Egyptians didn't make a sharp distinction between physical and spiritual causes of illness. A person might be sick because of an injury, or because they had angered a spirit, or because they had been cursed by an enemy. Treatment, therefore, needed to address both physical and spiritual dimensions. For physical injuries, the Egyptians developed effective techniques. They could set broken bones, splinting them with wooden sticks and linen bandages to hold the bone in place while it healed. They could stitch deep cuts using thorns or bone needles and thread made from animal sinew. They knew how to stop bleeding by applying pressure and by using certain plant materials that had styptic properties. Burns were treated with applications of cooling substances, mud, certain plant saps, or animal fats mixed with soothing herbs. While these treatments weren't as effective as modern burn care, they did provide some relief and protection against infection.
Herbal medicine was highly developed. The Egyptians had identified hundreds of plants with medicinal properties and had learned how to prepare and administer them. Some herbs were pain relievers, containing natural analgesic compounds. Others had antimicrobial properties that could help fight infection. Still others could reduce fever, ease digestive problems, or address other common ailments.
Willow bark, for instance, contains salicin, a compound related to aspirin, and could be chewed or made into a tea to relieve pain and reduce fever. Honey, which has natural antibacterial properties, was used to treat wounds and prevent infection. Garlic was consumed both as food and medicine, valued for its ability to ward off illness. Various herbs were used as laxatives, emetics, or digestive aids.
Preparation of these remedies was often the province of older women who had accumulated knowledge over years of experience. They would gather the appropriate plants at the right time of year, dry them or prepare them fresh, and administer them with specific instructions about dosage and timing. This knowledge was passed down within families and communities, a valuable heritage of practical healing wisdom.
For some conditions, treatment took the form of protective amulets or spells rather than physical remedies. A woman in labor might wear an amulet depicting the hippopotamus goddess Taweret, who protected women during the dangerous process of childbirth. A sick child might have spells recited over them, calling on protective spirits to drive away the illness.
These spiritual approaches to healing weren't simply superstition. They provided psychological comfort and support, which could have real effects on a person's ability to cope with illness and recover. The social support involved in healing rituals, family and community members gathering to help and show concern, also contributed to healing by reducing isolation and stress.
Understanding of anatomy was limited but growing. Through the experience of butchering animals and occasionally seeing the results of serious injuries, people developed some knowledge of the internal structure of the body. They could see that there were bones, muscles, major blood vessels, and organs like the heart, liver, and lungs. They understood that damage to certain organs was fatal. A pierced heart or liver, for instance, meant certain death. They also understood that there were connections within the body, that cutting a major blood vessel led to bleeding and death, that damage to the spine could cause paralysis, that head injuries could lead to unconsciousness or death. This practical anatomical knowledge would be built upon in later periods as Egyptian medicine became more sophisticated. Hygiene practices helped maintain health. People bathed regularly in the Nile or washed with water drawn from the river. While they didn't understand germ theory, they knew from experience that cleanliness was associated with health. Hair was kept clean and was sometimes cut short or shaved, especially in hot weather. Both men and women sometimes shaved their heads and wore wigs made of human hair or plant fibers, which could be kept cleaner than natural hair. Clothing was washed regularly,
taking advantage of the natural bleaching and antibacterial properties of sunlight. Linen clothes would be soaked in the river, beaten on rocks to loosen dirt, and laid out in the sun to dry.
Diet, though simple, was generally adequate when harvests were good. The combination of grain, vegetables, fish, and occasional meat provided reasonable nutrition. Beer contributed B vitamins and other nutrients. The diet was low in fat and sugar by modern standards, which protected against some of the chronic diseases associated with modern diets, though it provided little buffer against times of scarcity.
When harvests failed or the Nile flood was inadequate, famine could strike, leading to malnutrition and starvation. In these times, people would eat whatever they could find, more wild plants, roots, seeds, even things that weren't normally considered food. Conflict over scarce resources might break out between communities. The memory of famine years would be preserved in stories and traditions, reminding people of the precariousness of life and the importance of storing surplus in good years. Old age, when people lived to experience it, brought its own challenges. Arthritis from years of physical labor made movement painful. Failing eyesight made fine work difficult. Loss of teeth affected the ability to eat. Older people became dependent on younger family members for care, which was considered a sacred duty.
But age also brought respect and status. Elders were valued for their knowledge, experience, and wisdom. They played important roles in teaching the young, in making decisions, in leading ceremonies, and in maintaining traditions. An elderly person who remained mentally sharp was a treasure to the community, a living library of knowledge and history.
Death, when it came, was marked with rituals that showed both grief and care. The dead were mourned by their families and communities. The body was prepared, washed, perhaps anointed with oils, and placed in a grave with objects that would be needed in the afterlife. The grave was marked in some way, ensuring that the person would be remembered.
And so we come to the end of our journey. We've walked through a day in ancient Egypt, before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before history was written down. We've seen the sunrise over the Nile, worked in the fields, rested in the heat of midday, and gathered by the fire as darkness fell.
These people, 6,000 years removed from us, were not so different from you and me. They loved their children. They worked hard to provide for their families. They found joy in simple pleasures, good food, the company of friends, music and dancing under the stars. They faced their fears with courage. They honored their dead with care. They lived full lives in rhythm with the river and the seasons. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember them. Remember the woman grinding grain before dawn, the farmer checking his irrigation channels, the children playing by the river, the potter shaping clay with skilled hands, the elders telling stories by firelight. They are gone now, dust on the desert wind.